How did I get into this? About 15 years ago, I was sitting in my office at Manchester, and a colleague, Bernard Walters, knocked on my door and said, "I've just had the strangest thing happen." And I said, what was that, Bernard? And he said, "I've been contacted by an ex-student who says she now works for an essay writing company," which we'd never heard of at that point. I don't know if this is going to keep popping all the way through.
I think, anyway, it was a comment in.
Oh, I see, it's a comment. Okay, cool. Right, I'll just assume they're all positive. Anyway, so Bernard said I've had contact from this former student who works for an essay writing company, which we had never heard of at that point. This was about 2009 or something. And the student, ex-student, had contacted me and said, "Hi, Bernard, I did your master's course, whatever, 3 years ago. I now work for an essay writing company, and I'm just letting you know that one of your master's students this year has submitted the assignment, your assignment, to my company, and it's come to me." So that's immediately a very interesting world of ethics, whereas this person, she worked writing essays, that was her job, but when it came to her old department and one lecturer in particular, she felt that crossed some ethical threshold, and so she tipped him off. We never found out who the student was. So I kind of got into looking at contract cheating. And where it really started before we got into the world of essays was sites like Rent-A-Coder, which is where people who needed bits of code, for example, they run a small business or something and needed some code, they would put a job on Rent-A-Coder, and then coders would bid for it, and you could see the scores from their past jobs. So that's all kind of quite legitimate. Like eBay, you could see reviews from previous people who bought work by the coder. So looking at that, and I used to teach a data analysis course for first years. I was looking on Rent-A-Coder, and then I thought, hold up a second. And one of my students had put their assignment of my course on Rent-A-Coder. And I thought, okay, this is now spreading right for sort of curious interest in like in my pack. So I registered as a coder on Rent-A-Coder and tried to bid to get the job. But I didn't have any feedback from past, and unsurprisingly, I didn't get the job, so I never found out who that student was. So contract cheating. That's the first of the stories. I think they only go downhill from here. So, so what is contract cheating? It's a particular form of academic malpractice or plagiarism in which students undertake a contract, buy in from a third-party commercial provider some work for them. So that could be essay writing services. You could pay a friend or a fellow student. You could do reverse classifieds, I think, which is like Rent-A-Coder, where you put your job up and people bid for it. So it's any situation where you are buying in the work. And this has become a significant problem. Now, here is a very moving story. Ever since I accidentally burnt holes in my pajamas after experimenting with a chemistry set on my 8th birthday, I've always had a passion for science. Not Einstein. This was on a student personal statement when they applied to university from high school. Okay, and the agency that runs the admission service started scanning all the personal statements for originality. And this story was in 2011 was submitted by 234 students who applied for science degrees. So either there's been an epidemic of pajama burning, or something is afoot. So contract cheating. The brief look on the internet shows that there are many companies out there bidding to provide essays for money. I'm afraid these slides are from the UK, but I did put at least one top-notch assignment helped by Aussie PhD experts to sort of pitch to the local crowd, the equivalent of hello Perth, it's good to be here. So there is a proliferation of companies offering to provide essays for payment. Now, because we're involved in universities, we're kind of interested in this, hopefully, that this is kind of deals with our day job. But there is also an economic problem, which is what does the proliferation of people buying and submitting assignments, what is the economic problem? Well, what that is doing is weakening, damaging the signal of quality of graduate students. that the more that students are able to bypass academic assessment by submitting work that's not their own, submitting stuff they've bought in, that weakens the quality, the strength of the signal about the quality of a student, and that therefore affects postgraduate degrees, employers, etc. And it also affects negatively other students who aren't buying in, because it means that those students with whom they're competing are getting an advantage over them by buying in those products. So there's an economic problem, and that obviously, when you get into the areas of law and medicine, and maybe airline pilots, that becomes particularly sort of problematic. But there's an economic problem there, and therefore that creates some incentives, which we'll come on to. There is a huge amount of information asymmetry involved here, in that we don't really know which students are doing it. We're very bad at identifying the students who are doing it. Employers don't know, have less quality information about their students because of this problem. The bigger it gets, the more of a problem that is. Students themselves also have significant problems in terms of asymmetry of information, because it's quite hard to find out who are the good essay providers and who are the bad essay providers, who's selling good stuff and who is selling lemons. And if you spend time in the forums, there is just huge amounts of information of people trying to find out who are the good companies, and other people saying, no, those companies are bad. And you think, okay, what's the incentive here? The incentive here is for the scamming companies who give you junk or give you nothing to churn the market, to churn the information, to muddy the waters so that students can't find out who are good, so the bad companies can keep selling. So I think they spend time in the forums basically trying to spread disinformation and stop students finding out who are the good quality providers. There have been various attempts to address information asymmetry on the cheating side. So, so this was from the UK, essayfraud.org, so protecting students from foreign essays and coursework fraud, basically an attempt to find a quality mark so that when you buy, you get good stuff.
So good quality cheating.
Good quality cheating. But clearly, absolutely hopeless, because there's no way of controlling who claims this. And I found last night, when I should have been doing other things, found Scam Fighter, which is new, which claims to provide the best essay writing service reviews, 800 disputes resolved. Like, this is, I think this is all just scam nonsense. But I looked up the guy who runs it, and I got his picture, and then I reverse Google imaged his picture to try and I couldn't find him, but I found him on Instagram, and I'm not obsessed. Here he is. Now, in front of a building. You can clearly see this has been photoshopped in. Clearly photoshopped in. And here he is, photoshopped, massive, huge man. So even the photos of the people who are purporting to provide the scam fighting sort of stuff, trust no one, sort of. And that makes it very difficult for the for buyers. Now, what are the incentives? Go back to the incentives. For students, students who are non-cheating, their incentive is to suppress the problem, limit the damage by reducing the scale of the problem because they are suffering as non-cheaters. For students who are trying to buy, their incentives are to try and find good information, and that's difficult. For staff, the incentives are, I think, or academic teaching staff, I think the incentives are quite mixed, because we generally care about academic integrity. But the incentives in terms of the amount of work trying to pursue a case and solve and identify the problem is significant, and therefore the incentives also pull you away from pursuing this. What's the incentive for higher education institutions? Well, as long as the problem isn't seen as too widespread and there are no overt signs that students are graduating and doing untold damage or something, and as long as it's not, this is just speculation, as long as it's not even across institutions, then in a sense, I think they don't really have too much of an incentive to look too hard, to invest the resources to really try and track this down. I think it's, of course, they have a commitment to academic integrity, but in terms of really putting in the resources to systematically look at IP addresses and look at submission practices and all those sorts of things you can do to try and identify problematic behavior, I'm not sure the incentives are necessarily there. And of course, if you do really look and invest those resources, what you'll do is you'll find more contract cheating. And if you do that, when you get freedom of information request, you'll see, for example, UNSW showing a 162% increase in their levels compared to 2020, which I heard anecdotally is because UNSW put in lots of effort to try and find and detect it. So the incentive is almost perverse in the sense of if you work hard to try and resolve a problem, you end up in the national press looking like you've got more of a problem. So there's a whole lot of interesting incentives going on. Right. There are many papers on contract cheating. It's become an issue, although not as many as I thought. I looked on Web of Science last night, and there are 149 papers on contract cheating, which I thought there would be more. In terms of the economic literature, as far as I can see, there's only one, dare I say it, brilliant. Certainly the best economic paper and the only economic paper that I can find on this with Michael and myself and some colleagues, which seems a bit odd because there are lots of interesting incentives in here, both theoretically and empirically, that one can investigate. So this is a paper that we published in 2015 in which we did a discrete choice experiment with students to look at their willingness to pay for essays. And this work I'm going to present today is standing on the shoulders of stroke, largely copying that paper, but with some deviations. So I won't get into too much about what that paper did. I'll sort of say a little bit about that as I go through what we have done. So what is this paper? It's going to be the first Australian economic studies student demand for commercially provided coursework. So we see lots of information about all those companies on the supply side. This is looking at student demand in Australia. I'm going to derive willingness to pay for essays of differing quality. We'll look at the role of risk and penalty in the decision to buy and the willingness to pay, how much people would pay for essays as it becomes more riskier and more penalties associated with it are increased. We're going to try and segment the market into different sorts of students. And we're going to test whether personality traits are associated with those different segments, which is where the psychopathy of the title comes in. So that's what. So we're going to look at the demand for essays. That's going to be in terms of the characteristics of the essay and the institutional environment in which you might submit your essay. So if you're going to buy an essay, you'd be interested in, well, how much is it going to cost me? How good is it? What grade will I get? How likely is it I'll get caught? What's the risk? And what will happen to me if I am caught? So the penalty. That's of the essay and also the institutional environment. And then we're going to try and bring in student characteristics in terms of what are their grade expectations if they do the work themselves rather than buy, because that's a comparator, do it themselves or buy. Things that might shape that are the workload pressure you're under at that point. Maybe you wouldn't buy if you didn't have 4 assignments coming up in the next 2 weeks. Then demographics and personality type. So that's the intention at least. So we do this via a discrete choice experiment. Yes, sorry.
Is risk the probability of being caught, or risk is the risk preferences of the individual?
So we're going to deal with, it's a little bit on both sides. So it's going to be, we're going to show them, tell them what the risk of getting caught is, and then we're going to try and personality type to get some stuff about them as individuals and their risk attitudes. Yeah, thank you. Please, yeah, any questions, please do go for it. And so it's pretty easier to explain the experiment if you start to see some options. So here is an option to buy a piece of coursework. It has a grade, price, the risk of being caught. So if 100 people buy and submit, one of them is caught. And if you're, what's the penalty? Suspended from the university for a year, re-enter next academic year. That gives you a hint about what the attributes and levels are, and here they are. 4 grade levels, 2 risk levels, 1 in 100, 1 in 1,000. 2 penalties, get 0% for that course unit, and then more severely you get suspended for a year and re-enter thereafter, and then different price levels. So back to option 1, you can create a set with another option. Didn't choose a very good set here because the penalty is the same for all of them, but the other penalty is 0% for the unit. So that's what the choice sets that we gave people look like, and they always had the option of none. I wouldn't buy any of those, I would do the work myself. So there's no coercion to buy.
Yeah.
Yes?
Sorry. This high distinction and distinction, do students know their grade before?
So the person who's, I'll say more about the sample in a moment, but this was, we recruited students on a particular course unit, just one course unit at one university, when they had an assignment due in 3 weeks. So we tried to make it very, very specific, and the person who ran the unit gave us the course, those mark intervals as being what students would understand. So I'm going to...
You can dial up a mark. But if I'm a purchaser of a cheap essay,
yes.
Can I say I want a B+ essay?
Yes. Different sites have different policies, but on some of them they have drop-down boxes, which is how long is it, what level is it, like 1,500 words, year 1, how many pages, and what grade do you need. Because people might not want to go too high because that looks suspicious. Yeah. So yes, those are what the attributes look like. This is done in 2021 at an Australian university. The good thing about having 2 collaborators at 2 different universities in Australia is the veil of ignorance is maintained. As I mentioned, it was done on 1 module. So I think this kind of work is really best done when students have got a specific piece of work and you're asking them about that, rather than a generic, would you? Well, I might not do it on that module because I kind of get that, or I like it, or whatever on that one. I just want to get it out of the way and get through to next year. Maybe I would on that one. So this was on a single module that was counted, the piece of work counted for 35% of their mark, and we did it with them 3 weeks before they were due to submit. So when they're in there, they're thinking about it, hopefully. We had a sample of 347 people, which becomes 340 after cleaning. I'll explain where those 7 people went. And each person completed 10 choice sets. So something about the sample. When Michael and I and colleagues did similar study in the UK, in that GBO paper, one of the things we found was that students who had English as an additional language were significantly more likely to buy. That and risk preferences we found were significant. So let's have a look at that in terms of our sample. English as a first language, about 75% I think did. But a significant portion didn't. We'll see if that has an effect shortly. Age is quite a tale, but the median age is 19 years old, mean of 22. Crucially, what did the students think they were going to get for the piece of work? So 4 thought they would fail, and then we have a distribution.
Without cheating.
Yeah, this is if you did the work yourself, what do you think you're going to get?
Okay.
Sorry. So this is, thank you. Yeah, so we asked them, and I'll show you why that's important in a moment. We asked them how many hours they were going to work on it if they did themselves, and what grade they thought they would get. And we also, we also asked them how many deadlines have you got in the next 3 weeks. So 15% or so had 5 coming up. Most of them had 3. So maybe that will be a predictor of what people's willingness to pay and buy. That shouldn't say workload. Well, yeah, it is workload. We asked them to predict how many hours they would spend on this piece of work. These figures seem quite high to me. But the median was 20 hours. Again, this might be a predictor of if you're prepared to buy in to save that time. Okay, we also asked them percent of people you thought have bought, traded or sold notes, essays or assignments at your university, and they thought about a third had. We asked them if they had, and 6% said they had. Quite interestingly, when you look at the free open form questions about that, what are they buying? Quite a lot of them are buying notes rather than assignments, which may be apparent to you, but I didn't realise this. So these are some of the comments. I bought notes online. I wasn't sure my notes were good enough. They said actually it turned out their notes were good enough. And everyone in the WhatsApp group put in $2 each, and they bought some notes, etc. So there are other things being bought as well, and the extent to which that's malpractice. Not. It's like having a tutor, buying a tutor.
Or buying a textbook.
Yeah, exactly.
Do you feel that traded seems less?
Yes.
Seems lighter than like I've got my notes. I missed a class.
Yep.
Can I have your notes?
Yep.
No problem.
Yeah.
A financial transaction seems quite different to I'm trading notes. Is there a reason or?
We disaggregated actually in the follow-up question to everyone who said yes to that. We then got into the buying, selling, and exchanging. So we have that, but I foolishly haven't put that on the slide. And the trading is more common than the buying. So it's kind of like group work and different sorts of behaviours.
Which again seems much to the lighter shade of collective learning.
Mm-hmm.
Everything from I missed a class, or to where I've got to work. How about we go alternate weeks or something, and it doesn't seem any.
That to me seems absolutely fine, and as students are more pressured financially, then that sort of thing seems quite. Yeah, I think it's very rare for students to work entirely on their own. I think sharing information and peer groups, we try to encourage peer learning and whatever. So, yeah, I don't really see. I guess you don't care about that, I think necessarily, but there's a range of behaviours and clearly sort of sharing notes or that kind of specialisation and becomes more problematic when we do online tests, and we know that students sit in groups and they open the test, everyone on their computer, and they say, right, you do question 1, I'll go on to question 2 or whatever, and then so there's at that point that specialisation and exchanging becomes more problematic. So let's get into some results. So we have, after I've kicked out 7 people, we've cleaned 7 people, which I'll explain in a moment. We had 340 people making 10 choices in their choice sets. So what do we get in terms of results? 222, at 64%, always chose the none option in all 10 of their sets. Unsurprisingly, 36% therefore chose to buy on at least one occasion. So in one of their choice sets or more, they chose the buy option. I think in paper with Michael in the UK, I think it was more like 50-50, but I should know and we'll have to check. But so we just got over a third of people who are potential buyers.
Australians more honest.
I think that's right.
But it does sort of correspond to the 1/3 perception.
Right. Oh yeah, it does. You're right. Yeah, that's a good point actually. Yeah. It does indeed correspond to the 1/3 perception. And if we dig into that behaviour a bit more, this is buying frequency. So I've kept everybody in at the moment, 347 before cleaning. So 222 of them never bought. 11 bought in every choice set. Okay. But what I find moderately reassuring is that is not the common behaviour. It's like people are evaluating the essays and saying some of them, yeah, I would buy that one, and in other sets saying no, I wouldn't buy any of them. So this sort of relatively uniform distribution, I think, is quite encouraging. So we asked people, both of those groups, the never buy and the always buy, for some more information about their behaviour. So for people who never bought, 150 of them chose the option about why that was, in terms of it being morally wrong. these two groups didn't really believe that the essays would be of the quality, etc. That they, which is kind of like the real problem we have in the market. But they kind of brought that into the choice experiment, whereas we expressly said they're all going to be what they're advertised as. And then these people are never bought, but this is kind of more just about the prices and the risks and the penalties. So these are potentials, but the levels of price and risk and penalty were such that they never actually were induced to come into the market. What about the people who always bought? So those 11 people who always bought, 7 of them chose the option as to why, which was I didn't really take account of the prices because it was hypothetical. So those are the 7 who we kicked out of the sample, because if they're not taking account of price, then they're sort of breaking the rules of the game, and they're not amenable to our the models we're going to estimate. The other 4 are just like, well, they were just always the best option. I weighed up the options and it was worth doing it. Yeah, okay. So those 4 are kept in, those 7 are kicked out.
Excuse me, the first one, would that also be a potential reason for all the other cases that are not 0?
Could you, Alexa, could you?
You haven't asked the others. You know,
Yeah.
Once it cheated 9 times, you haven't asked the
Or
others.
8 or 7 or 6?
Correct, but if they, why would they? Okay. Well, if you don't take account of the prices, but you buy in 5, what would that mean? Why would you not buy in the other 5? Okay, so you just think about risk and penalty.
All the
Great.
time. Yeah,
Probably
the other.
Okay.
call 1 in 100, 1 in 1,000. 1 in 1,000, I mean, 1 in 100.
Okay, so that would be people who are discounting price, but are treating the other attributes seriously. Okay, it's plausible.
Wouldn't price come up as having an insignificant coefficient or subsample if that was the case?
Good answer, then. We'll see about the price insignificant shortly as we segment them. So we're going to estimate choice models. So we're assuming that the utility comes from the price, the grade, which is dummy, is high distinction, credit, 2 risk levels, 2 penalty levels, and the status quo. The none opt-out. So what does that mean? Just for people who aren't so familiar with this kind of experiment, let's take person 1 doing choice set 1. There are 3 options of essays. All the essays have got a price, they've got a risk, they've got a penalty, and they've got a grade associated with them. So there are 3 essays to choose from. The none option is the 4th option. There's no price, risk, or penalty. What's the grade of your none option? Well, we pipe in the prediction that they've told us that they're going to get. So maybe the student thinks they're going to get a distinction. And then we add this 0-1 dummy to indicate there's something special about this option, which is that it's a none option. So that's what our data looks like, and then we have more sets. So this grade of the none option is respondent specific. And we have their choices. So that's what we're analysing. This is a conditional logit model, a very simple model, trying to explain those choices as a function of the attributes. So these are aggregate average effects, and in this model, I've removed those people, the 222, who never chose to buy. They're going to come back in, but we often just exclude the people who opt out in every single choice set. So let's just have a quick eyeball to sort of see if things are looking okay or if they're looking like something's gone wrong. So everything but 1 term is insignificant. Price is negative. Grade of the high distinction is positive and greater than the value for distinction and greater than that for merit, with the base category being a pass. The risk levels are negative, and 1 in 100 is treated as worse than 1 in 1,000, which is intuitive, and similarly, the worst penalty is got a bigger negative marginal utility than the lower penalty level. So that seems, on average.
Is there some endogeneity in there in that if you're a pass to merit level student, the value of a high distinction essay is probably reduced because you'll get caught.
Oh, so the value of a high distinction if you are a merit student is weakened because you're worried that will give you away. That's a very interesting point, because we're going to do willingness to pays, and it's going to depend upon the gap, the upgrade you're getting, but you're sort of suggesting you can over upgrade.
Yeah.
Okay. At Manchester, where this, I don't know, I'll have to find out at this university, whichever it was. So at Manchester, we do anonymous marking and we have lots of students, but crucially, there is no, we don't have the expectation reality gap because it's just a number that we mark, which is good for sort of anti-discrimination, but it's problematic for identifying cheating. So it's a good point, but I'm going to say that's a good point and then skip it.
Ignore it. Yeah.
But it's an interesting point. It's that thing about not wanting to overshoot. So we get the willingness to pays. We'll just do it very, very simply before we get into a more interesting model, which is the ratio of the marginal utility of the non-monetary attribute over the beta on price. So this is relative. That over that is relative how much you pay to get a high distinction rather than the base category, which is that pass category. So no risk or penalty. These are the very simple back of the envelope sort of willingness to pays we're getting from that, which is $143 for a merit, $231 for a distinction, and then $680 for a high distinction. But that is without any risk or penalty effects. That's a risk and penalty is set at 0. But it just gives you a rough ballpark figure of what this suggests. Right, so now we're going to extend it. We're going to bring in risk and penalty, and we're going to combine them, which is what we did in the GBO paper, which is we'll have a measure risk penalty of 1, which is the lowest of both things, lowest risk, lowest penalty, and then RP22 is the greatest detection risk and the strongest penalty. So we're going to combine these, make a risk penalty measure. Expectation is this one will have the least effect, this one will have the strongest effect, and we don't know about the ordering of those two. Yes?
And so you get 0 for 35%.
Yeah.
And so your realistic probability of passing the unit is gone.
So this would be 0 for the module, for the whole thing?
Yeah, so the module's worth 35%?
No, the assignment they're buying is worth 35% of the module.
And a module is how much of the unit? Or is that the correct language? I don't know.
I don't know. For me, I'm using module and unit as the same thing. So like maybe 10 unit or modules in a year.
So if you get 0 for 35% for something, most students are going to struggle to pass.
Okay.
So either way, it's a fail. Is that what I'm just in terms of the penalty regime here?
Okay. This piece of work is 35% of your mark for the module. Say the module is Environmental Economics 101.
Yeah.
So if you get caught, you won't just get 0 for that piece of work, you'll get 0 for the whole of the unit.
Okay, you fail the unit.
Yeah.
Okay, so the minimum penalty is to fail the whole unit.
Yeah, if you get caught buying on
Okay,
it.
so it's quite a severe penalty.
Okay.
Sorry?
Yeah, no, that's good to know.
We call modules things in units.
Okay, that's my
Parts of units.
my bad, as I say. Might change that.
Should use institutionally neutral language.
I agree. Okay, I will change, and I will certainly tailor it to the country that it was done in and I'm presenting in. So basically just like English arrogance, really, that I'll just use the terms that we would use at home and expect you to understand it. Okay, is that right, James?
Yeah, welcome back.
You guys are amazing. Right. So the other thing we're going to do is bring in some personality traits. So when Michael and I did these experiments back in whenever, we did it face-to-face with students, which meant it was painful to do it. It was quite a small sample size. We only had 90 students. but it meant we could play some gambles for real cash and estimate risk preferences for them. Can't do that here. We get a bigger sample size, but we can't do that really. So we're going to bring in some some personality traits. So Rundle et al., which is a paper with Guy Curtis, a co-author from psychology, looked at why students do and do not engage in contract cheating. And they found that the dark triad personality traits were the most effective at predicting why students don't engage. Now, the dark triad personality traits are, and I've picked people here I think particularly embody some of them. No, they are narcissism, Machiavellianism, and psychopathy, non-clinical psychopathy. So, Machiavellianism being manipulative and cynical, narcissism, self-centeredness and superiority, and non-clinical psychopathy being callous and impulsive. So this is our first set of traits. There are a set of, this is just a subset of them, of questions you ask people. And just to say, and I should have put this at the very beginning, people who mess with me always regret it. So that's strong. So before you ask any difficult questions, I would strongly agree on that one. So, so there's a whole stack of these questions. So the second set concerned risk. So I mentioned that Michael and I and others, our colleagues, got risk preferences from gambles. We can't do that here. So there's this is just a subset of them, a whole stack of questions about risk that lead to two scales, risk-taking scales 1 and 2. The first one is uncontrollable, unconcerned with losses, emotional and associated with positive arousal. I'm definitely going to win with this lottery ticket. Second lot is much more cognitive and associated with negative connotations, etc. So we're going to drop out for each individual, based on their responses, score about their Machiavellianism, their narcissism, their psychopathy, and 2 risk scores. So that's what's coming in. Right, what's also going to be different now is we're estimating a latent class model. We're going to bring everybody back into the sample, even the people who said, no, I wouldn't buy in all of their choice sets. So back to 340 people. What we're doing, in case you aren't familiar with these models, we're identifying latent segments, latent groups within the sample, each with their own different utility function. And respondents are probabilistically assigned to each of those classes or segments. So we're looking at what marketeers do. You know, you're trying to understand different segments of your potential market. So we had an aggregate average utility function before in that conditional logit model. Now each of our segments is going to have their own utility function. We can't endogenously identify the number of classes. You just have to estimate a 2-class, a 3-class, a 4-class, etc., and ex post look at information criteria to choose what's the optimal best fit number of classes. So we used the Bayesian information criteria, and that came up with 3-class model. I'm going to try and avoid hitting you with vast numbers of standard errors and there's lots of numbers on the screen. So we'll see whether or not I've made it clearer or less clear. First class. We've got the price, the grade utilities, risk penalty utilities, and the null option. So first, class 1, price is not significant. These people are not taking account of price. There's some positive utility from a high distinction, but not for the other grade levels. And they have negative weights associated with the different risk penalty regimes. That's sort of most lax. These two are above that, which makes sense. That's a strange result. This is not significant, and that's a bit odd. But
just to anticipate, we might need to be out at 10-2,
okay,
depending on if there's a class.
I'll be okay. I'll finish at 5. Okay, thank you. Class 2, everything is significant except the none option, and we've got the right ordering and signs. So that looks good. And class 3, taking account price, the grades are in the right order. none of these risk penalty levels are affecting their choices. They're only being affected by the most severe level of risk and penalty. You have to really ramp up the risk and penalty for it to bite into them in terms of their choices. So I would say these class 1 are the never going to buy. Class 2 are the potential buyers, but there's a high risk penalty sensitivity. They're very sensitive. And these are potential buyers who are largely insensitive to most risk penalty regimes. And that is the size of the predicted segments. So about 26% are in the maybe buyers. Class membership effects. No effects of English as an additional language, so that contradicts our previous paper. The number of assignments, the number of hours you think it would take you to work, the respondent's sex, all of those things have no effect. Narcissism and Machiavellianism have no effect in terms of an effect on which class people are in. But, and we do find an effect in terms of psychopathy. So low psychopathy scores much more likely to be in class 1 and much more likely to be in class 3. And psychopathy in those other papers by Guy Curtis et al. Was the strongest of those dark triad factors. There is a weak risk effect in here in terms of people who are more risk averse are in class 1. So yeah, the psychopathy effect is quite significant. I'm going to skip those two. Willingness to pay. It's going to be conditioned on the quality of what you're buying, your expectation of what your own grade is, and the risk and penalty regime. So,
conditional on the fact that it does have an influence.
Yes. So yes. So for some of those situations, it won't have an influence because they don't care about that particular risk and penalty. So your willingness to pay for an essay is going to be utility you get from it, B to buy, minus what you would have got if you submitted your own work. So that's got to be an improvement. And then you've got to overcome the risk penalty effect. That's going to be the utility gain from buying, and then divide that by the marginal utility of money gives you your willingness to pay. Obviously, if there's no risk or penalty, then that last one just drops off. So for class 2, under a 0 risk penalty regime, those are the willingness to pay. If risk and penalty are at 0. But it gets a bit messy. Right, what have we got here? This is saying, for a student who thinks they're going to get a pass level mark, for a high distinction, if it's 0 risk penalty, they pay 935, which is what I just said. But then that willingness to pay starts to erode as we ramp up the risk penalty. So it drops to 457 at the lowest risk penalty regime, 1 in 1,000 and 0% for the unit. And all the other ones, it becomes negative. Effectively, you wouldn't buy. The risk penalty effect is so strong as to drive it to 0. For class 3, of course, they don't care about those first 3 risk penalty regimes. So they don't get that down effect, but they do in the highest effect, and it drops down to $275. Still going to get a pass, they think, but now for a lower quality essay, the price is willingness to pay to drop down to this, and then again they drop to 0 for class 2. Class 3, they are stable, but then drop down to 68, and you get the picture. So you're getting values which are dependent on what you think you'll get, what you'll buy, and what the risk penalty regime is. And of course, we have another table, but don't worry, I haven't done it. If I thought I was going to get a merit, what would I pay for these distinction and the high distinction, etc. Yes.
Pretty precisely estimated based on the fact that you've got some things that are $50 and stuff that are significant. Is that pretty consistent pattern? I
haven't done that properly yet. I haven't done the bootstrapping. What I've done is taken the willingness to pays for these different components, added them up, and seen whether or not they are what the net value of those things is. What I should be doing is drawing from the estimates with the standard error on them and
So maybe some of those smaller ones are actually.
They might be overlapping with zero. Yeah.
The psychopaths seem to be rich.
They are less.
Crazy mutation.
Yeah. Well,
It's just one of several essays I've got coming up.
Or we value the money less.
well, okay. I'll finish and then we can speculate and discuss. So we have coherent results. You may think they're coherent in terms of ordering, etc. They're coherent maybe in other respects. Do we believe them? There's risk of misreporting in any stated preference response. So that, people might not treat money as seriously as they would, but at the same time, they might also fear recrimination and being caught. So who knows what the net effect is. We see a market size of about 25%, with a max willing to pay of 935. Extensions didn't get information about how many jobs they're working, how many hours they work, and I think that might be an important factor in people choosing to buy. There's the issue of blackmail, which we'll come on to. There's ChatGPT, which probably everyone wants to talk about, but I'm not going to do it now. And yeah, that's it.
Thank you, Dan.
Oh, I'm itching to ask a question.
Thanks, Dan. It's interesting. I mean, so it made me slightly more relaxed because 70% are probably doing the right thing. Then you've got the nutcases who, for whatever reason, always buy. And there's that middle group. I just wonder if you could just, in your discussion, sort of do a further analysis of the policy issue for universities, which is how do you stop that middle? How do you flip the penalties or the detection rates so that class 2, the cheating by that class 2 is squeezed out, or purchasing essays? So that's by way of the comment.
Yeah. Do you want to do a couple and then I'll respond? Just
depending on you.
Okay. Well, I think the detection. I suppose you can do it different ways. You can design your assessments in a way that makes it harder for people to do that. So if you have regular meetings with your students in the run-up to a piece of work, that makes the last-minute buying more problematic, etc. So you can do it in the assessment design, but that's harder as your student numbers become bigger, etc. Detection is very hard, but some universities have put in quite a lot of effort to do that by looking at IP addresses and people who are using Cadmus, like I know you're trialing Cadmus, which has some capability to identify IP addresses, and so you can work on that. I think the detection is really, I don't know whether it's a lost cause, but I think it's very, very difficult.
So it's expensive to increase detection. It's cheap to increase the penalties. But there's a danger if you go after class 3 and have the penalties so dire that even class 3 stop cheating, that you could have an adverse effect on class 2, where you just want, basically if they get calls, it's more of a, you don't want them excluded from the university, you want to keep them in the system. So that's another comment.
Okay, I'm going to, in order to let other people.
Yeah, very good research. On your last slide, on the concluded slide, last one, you're talking about this market size, and it's good. It's a good sign to have results all being coherent. But we know that when people observe in trials, whatever experiment, they might change the behavior, whatever you call it, Henry effect or all that.
Mm-hmm.
Given the context of the application and the timing of your twist experiment, is that a concern at all? Because although you have some analysis picked up all these, always say no or not buy or anything, but that might have an impact on the size, your result on the size of the market, how big the sum is actually buying, and also their perception on the risks. The real perception of risk in the market and their perception of risk in your experiment. Is there any way that you can have some market observation or indirect evidence cross-validate your
It's very hard to get any real market information. I mean, it's really hard. I think in terms of people, I put some of what you're talking about in terms of people it's kind of misreporting, not necessarily in a deliberate way, but just not indicating what they would do. I think that's, essentially we don't know. I think when we do environmental evaluation, often we think about there being a warm glow effect, and we're worried about that. I think there's less of a warm glow here. I bet there might be a hypothetical bias of, oh yeah, I'd buy it when I really wouldn't. I think there's also kind of a bit of a cold fear of recrimination, which is students having to answer this on a particular unit at their own university. So what I should say in terms of extensions, actually, what should ask people is, what do they think the risk is? So we've used 1 in 100, 1 in 1,000, but we should try and find out what they think the risks are, because that would be quite interesting, and you could then use that in the levels.
I wonder about, like in behavioural economics, like a nudge approach to manipulate their perceptions of the risk.
Okay.
Like, it might not take much to trigger a disproportionate fear of being caught. Or victimise one person, make a pillory one, string them up at the front of the university. That would fix it, you know.
Okay.
Let's at least what we do is to take this on. We tell people when we spotted it. We make it very clear. As in, okay, we're very disappointed in you. Last assignment, several people have picked up, cheating, whatever. So we sort of communicate that it's happening rather than try to hide it.
Even if it's not, you can say that we're onto it.
Yeah, I think our university wasn't anything that's fun but unethical. They're all over that sort of thing. So I think you had a question.
Thinking about the presentation, I think there might be another reason for buying contract cheating, because there are a lot of studying about the programs in Australia or other foreign countries. And for some students, they couldn't speak English when they arrive in foreign country. So even if they know they will face high risk and high price, but they couldn't pass the exam. So they have to buy some contract cheating from other people.
Yeah, I think that's yeah. I suppose the idea that people are concerned about whether they're going to fail, and also about the about language issues, are highly plausible. I think and we found in our previous study that English language was a significant predictor. Here, that wasn't the case, which is a bit of a surprise. In terms of your own grade didn't predict your class membership, and nor did your language status. I think on the issue of raising fear, that's in part what the blackmail thing is about, which is what is an increasingly reported problem is that companies sell you the essay, you submit it, and then they come back to you and say, oh, well, we know you submitted it at that university, you need to give us $200 and keep giving us $200. Because, and for certain people who've done this for professional qualifications, they are now locked in. So what I meant to do on this study, and we'll do in the next one, is randomize people 50-50 to get some information about the possibility of blackmail, because that is a way you could, a non-university penalty way of making people
as well.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly.
There are questions from online. I think.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So, Julian, can you go? Okay.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me okay, Dan?
Just a little bit. So, yes.
Can you hear me? Okay. Can I just put an employer hat on? And I'm very glad I'm not in the room so that people can't throw things at me. So as an employer, I'll completely disregard any peer group work any collaborative work, any joint assessments, anything where any cheating can be involved. And let's just suppose, I mean, certainly this is my view, I want to see what somebody individually can do in the absence of any of these things. And given ChatGPT and given everything what you're saying, it's really a question here for interest in future work. Suppose a university, let's just call it Oxford, but it could be anywhere, right? It just could be anywhere. Decides that in future we will go back to the system that we had in the 1970s, which is that all grades will be based on individual work in an examination. So the concept of the assessment is simply dropped. You can do an assessment, you can do interim work, there will be assessments given, but they will not contribute to your final mark. The only thing that will contribute to your final mark is what you do yourself in a closed exam environment, where it is impossible, unless you can somehow break through the IT system you're going to use in the examination room, to be able to do that. Now, my question is, would that not provide this hypothetical university with a comparative advantage over other universities that didn't adopt it? And given what's happening, just fascinated by the prospect that universities might try to get one up on one another by doing this in future and going back to this system because of the demand from employers to get a pure result from the student rather than one that could be somehow contaminated by the amazing list of issues that you raised, which one sort of knew about at the back of one's head but didn't know in detail. I just wonder what you thought about this and whether there was some interesting work to be done. Sorry, I'll shut up in a second. About universities in terms of the percentage of purity that they had in their overall result, because I'd be interested in that as an employer. What percentage of your grade comes from untrackable, impossible to cheat results, and what comes from stuff that isn't? Sorry, I'm very glad I'm not in the room.
I think that's a really interesting point. I think. I think that this was always a problem, and then when COVID hit, and we, for example, in the UK, we went to open book online 7-day exams, etc. That opened up our last sort of bastion of security of the exam hall into, right. Well, now you've got 7 days, you could contract cheat on your exams, and I have been of the view that there needs to be at least some assessment which is example based. So I've argued at Manchester that we should have at program level just pick 1 or 2 core units every year, and that is an example, so that we have some signal which is we're very confident about. And Michael, I think, mentioned the other day about making it a requirement that you have to pass that particular component of the assessment, yeah, as well as the whole thing. So interestingly, I think we had a discussion at Manchester on Zoom the other day, a sort of university level meeting about ChatGPT and AI, and there is a sort of division of strategy, which is rethink assessment and new ways of assessing, etc., which I agree with, but I'd like more detail about what that looks like to be resilient to the problems. But the other one was, I think there was more support for we need to get more students back in the exam halls in order to have some security. And I see that the AI ChatGPT just opens it up on a huge, just a free version of this sort of thing, which is going to raise all sorts of issues. So I think the idea about some universities extolling that as a comparative advantage, I think, is interesting, because it says our grades are secure and very good quality. Right. It also sort of says we don't trust our students enough. We have to get them into examples because we think they'll cheat if we don't, which is not a good signal.
Thank you, Dan, for giving us this nice presentation.